The Hilo Massacre, Hawaii's Bloody Monday, August 1, 1938. By William J. Puette, Ph.D., Honolulu, University of Hawaii, Center for Labor Education and Research, 1988. As read by Shits Leopold. It was first published in 1988 on the 50-year memorial of the Hilo Massacre. At that time, the Center for Labor Education and Research was part of the College of Continuing Education and Community Service at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. In 1996, the center was transferred to the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. Introduction. In 1987, we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the writing of the U.S. Constitution. The outpouring of commentary is as great as one might have expected. Paeans to democracy and freedom of speech are almost countless. Few stop to notice that the Constitution as originally written in 1787 contained no specific provisions for democracy or free speech. The extent to which those qualities existed in the America of 1787 was to be found at the local level of government. Americans firmly believed that they enjoyed those rights. Among others, the rhetoric of revolution was more than mere rhetoric to the common people of America. Not everyone agreed with those popular assumptions. The common law heritage with which we began our constitutional system was based upon a notion of the master-servant relationship which did not grant to the employee the right of speech or collective action. As that 18th century notion evolved under our Constitution, it was little changed. Several basic legal assumptions made by the judicial system served to repress and restrict working men and women when they attempted to protect their rights and working conditions or to improve their standard of living. The first of these overriding assumptions was the importance of the continuity of production, and that workers, unless controlled, will act irresponsibly. Even the writing of the Bill of Rights, with its explicit prohibition of the passage of any law restricting the right of free speech or assembly, did not prevent the passage of laws restricting those very rights. Footnote: the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 forbade any criticism of elected or appointed federal officials. Similar restrictions on free speech were enacted in the southern states in defense of slavery. In Lincoln's suppression of free speech in Ohio in 1864, during World War I with the Sedition Act of 1917, to name only a few examples. Footnote end. Neither the courts nor Congress paid much attention to those basic rights when it came to labor relations. Workers had to struggle to gain those rights. In the face of legal representation, such as the Cordwainers case of 1809 which prohibited even discussion of organization, much less organizing to change working conditions, workers continued to organize and demand equality at the workplace. Not until 1935 did federal law explicitly recognize the right of workers to form organizations of their own choosing and to take collective action to secure their rights in economic justice. 3. The National Labor Relations Act finally accepted what workers had insisted upon even as the Constitution was being written: collective bargaining as an inherent right and not something granted to property and employers exclusively. But the passage of the Wagner Act was only the initial step in securing labor's rights. Employers regard the law as insignificant and one that would be shortly discarded by the Supreme Court, as the court had done to other New Deal legislation. The Legal Counsel of Hawaii Sugar Planters Association advised the trustees that the law was patently unconstitutional and need not be matter of concern. This was in line with the attitudes expressed on the mainland. Many battles, some even more deadly and tragic than the one described here, would have to be fought before labor's right to organize would be clearly recognized and the use of force, generally police forces and militia, would be restrained. At the local level, labor law generally consisted of anti-picketing statutes, criminal syndicalism legislation, and ordinances restricting public assembly. Hawaii's territorial laws were the equal of any of the states in their repressive nature. The Great Strike of 1920 frightened the political and economic power of Hawaii. The vigorous effort of the Japanese workers to redress their grievances and the skill they demonstrated in creating a labor organization throughout the sugar industry called forth a massive reaction by the planters and their political machine. Perhaps even more frightening to them was the effort to achieve a racial unity in the joint efforts of the Filipino and Japanese workers. To protect against such efforts in the future, severe and even more repressive laws were enacted. Trespass and criminal syndicalism laws viewed almost any speech or action regarding labor as evidence of criminal intent, and anti-picketing laws were freely applied to include a ban on union meetings. This tight net of law, it was thought, would at last be sufficient to restrain labor organization. The 1924 Filipino street strike proved them wrong. Despite police repression, the Filipino workers conducted a strike which rotated through the islands and lasted for over 6 months. Despite a police ban on meetings, defined as 2 or more workers, the sugar workers carried their strike to the limits of the physical and human resources. That strike brought the Hilo Massacre, the killing of 16 workers and 4 policemen. The official interpretation of that event was that it was the result of worker misbehavior. Over 60 workers were jailed and or deported. Nothing was said about the arming of hunters or positioning them around the strike camp. That was not deemed provocative or ill-advised. When the wave of labor organization began in 1933 as a response to the desperate conditions confronting the American worker, many Hawaiian workers, both plantation and maritime, were in California and on the West Coast, watching and participating in those struggles. The Vibora Luvuminda was organized by Antonio Fagel, based on his experiences in the California farm labor struggles in Watsonville. By 1935, the longshoremen were turning once again to the International Longshoremen's Association, as they had early in the 20th century when they organized locals in Hilo and Honolulu. It was this long, militant tradition of fighting for the rights of working men and women, despite the obstacles of political and judicial repression, that led the Inland Boatmen's Union and their allied workers to strike in 1938. It was the firm belief that as American citizens, the workers of Hilo had a right to express their solidarity with and support of their brothers and sisters in Honolulu. This story is about that conviction. As with many of labor's struggles, we know them primarily from the news media and the skimpy treatment given labor in our history books. Few outside labor know the details of the long struggle, and too many within the ranks of labor are unaware of the long and proud heritage which is theirs. A quantum change has taken place in the writing of labor history in the last quarter century. Young scholars are no longer content to accept the stories handed down. Labor historians are vigorously pursuing the record, painfully and carefully tracking down the events and the participants. The story told here exists entirely because the writer refused to accept that the records had disappeared or been destroyed. Repeated trips to the state archives and the Attorney General's office in search of the original report of the Territorial Attorney General led, after several months, to the discovery in the archives of the complete record, depositions, photographs, lists of participants, even samples of the bullets used by the police. From this trove of data, Puette has put together a complete picture this one event. When the ILWU and organized labor next pay tribute to the participants of the Hilo Massacre next August 1st, they will have the complete story to make their observance more meaningful. And that is the most important part of this piece of history. Workers today and tomorrow have as much need for the freedom to organize and to take collective action as did the workers of Hawaii in 1938. The wisdom of Frederick Douglass applies here. Where there is no struggle, there is no progress. What the men and women of Hilo confronted the police and Big Five with was no less than the history of struggle that has brought meaning to the notion of freedom of expression and human rights. Edward B. Chart, University of Hawaii. Part 1. Organizing. Clearly, the year 1938 marked a turning point in the social history of Hawaii. Still a long way from statehood in 1959, the territory had been growing and maturing as an economic power whose fortunes and future were very much a matter of concern to the federal government. President Roosevelt had begun to enact his progressive New Deal legislation so that by 1935 Congress had passed the Wagner Act legalizing workers' rights to join and be represented by labor unions. Nearly 100 years earlier, Hawaii's elite business leaders, most of them descendants of the early missionary families, had begun to consolidate their power over the island's economy and social structure, starting with the sugar plantations and branching out by means of an impressive network of interlocking directorates. They had by the 20s centralized virtually all economic power into the hands of 5 great factor companies: the Big Five, Alexander and Baldwin, C. Brewer, Castle and Cook, American Factors, and Theo Davies. Everything of significance from banks to shipping lines and sugar plantations to newspapers was tightly controlled by the Big Five. Fully 1/3 of the population of the islands was living on the plantations, with 70% of the people directly dependent on plantation economy. The regional director of the newly organized NLRB charged with enforcing the Wagner Act reported that laborers in Hawaii were more like slaves than free people. They have no chance to change their jobs or get away from their present environment. They speak and mumble in undertones. He described Hawaii as a picture of fascism, in which workers suspected of union sympathies were quickly identified and blacklisted. Hawaii's laborers faced almost insurmountable odds against unification and organization. Besides the autocratic control exercised by the Big Five, The labor force had been divided into racial blocks following the patterns of immigration established by the sugar planters over the years. After the number of native Hawaiians began to decline, Chinese were brought in, then successive waves of Portuguese, Japanese, and Filipino workers. Each new group was used to depress the wages of the former and the employer's insatiable quest for new sources of cheap and servile labor. The cultural gulf between these groups of workers was so enormous that unified action was, for many years, effectively subverted. There were Hawaiian strikes and organized Japanese and Filipino strikes, but they had all been beaten in the end, for the employers were organized and acted in unity, while the workers could not. Not until the longshoremen in Hilo and Kauai began organizing in 1935 did a truly interracial union movement emerge. No one ethnic group alone could muster the power to challenge the combined weight of the Big Five and the political machinery it controlled. The last great racial strike was put down on Maui on 1937. The newly organized Filipino Union, Vibora Luvaminda, valiantly attempted to win recognition from the Pu'unene sugar plantation. Like its predecessor in 1924, this strike was fiercely resisted by the plantation owners, and once again without the support of the other workers. Their cause was doomed. Harry Kamelku, 1905 to 1957, organizing Hilo. One of the most commonly held misconceptions about the emergence of the modern labor movement in Hawaii is that it was brought in by mainland organizers who, in the manner of the religious missionaries a century before, revealed a gospel of real unionism to poor, misguided local workers. This interpretation grossly ignores the key significance of a score of local Hawaiian, Japanese, and Filipino leaders whose union consciousness can be traced back to organizing efforts in the mid-19th century. In fact, if there is a father of the modern labor movement in Hawaii, the honor should most likely go to Hawaii's own Harry Lehua Kamelku, a Chinese Hawaiian who was born and raised in Hilo. Harry Kamelku was the primary organizer and leader of the first real union in Hawaii to be legally recognized as a bargaining representative. His story goes well beyond the events of the Hilo Massacre, and hopefully it will someday be told in full. But the basic outline of his accomplishments must be noted. Born October 3, 1905 in Hilo, he was raised near Hilo's waterfront in Waiakea town. In all likelihood he attended Waiakea High School through 7th grade and went to sea at age 16. Like many early labor leaders, Harry was educated in that ocean-going college of experience. His classroom the forecastle, his professors, brother seamen who for 12 years taught the tough young Hawaiian the meaning of the word brotherhood and the solidarity of the sea. It is believed, in fact, that the ubiquitous pidgin word, blala, or bra, first became popular in local Hawaiian idiom from its use around the docks. Harry to see firsthand the organizing that had been conducted on the west coast. He'd seen the struggles and the great benefits won by seamen and dock workers there. With his cousins, Chicken, Israel, and Henry, he walked the picket lines in the 1934 West Coast Maritime Strike. That crucial dispute had gained his West Coast brothers a 30-hour week, higher wages, union recognition, and coast-wide contracts. There he met Harry Bridges of the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, who began to show him the possibilities of organizing workers in Hawaii as well. He came home in 1935 determined to organize his fellow Hilo longshoremen and take on the Big Five at last. Unlike many great labor leaders, he was not a flowery public speaker. He was always sensitive to the feelings of the group. He most often described himself as a union agent rather than a president or director, and he took care not to grab the limelight from his union brothers. In fact, as an organizer, he seemed to have the uncanny ability to make each longshoreman he recruited feel as if the leadership were shared primarily with him. Practically everyone remembers him as a soft-spoken man, and above all a gentleman, not the wild, cursing and carousing longshoreman of popular legend. The Hilo Longshoremen's Association was formed on November 22, 1935, when Harry Kamelku and about 30 young longshoremen of almost every ethnic and racial origin common to the territory agreed to join forces and organize all the waterfront workers regardless of race or national origin. Harry was just 30, but commanded respect because of his experience and his unwavering sense of purpose. What he told them was that the union would give them the power to make the docks safer and give them the dignity they deserved as working men. He emphasized the Maritime Federation's slogan that an injury to one is an injury to all, and he worked hand in hand with the seamen who, though they were affiliated with the rival AFL, were involved in the same struggle for recognition. In 1936, a few short months after they first organized their local, they walked out and stayed out for several months. in support of the striking seamen. For Harry and the other longshoremen in Hawaii, solidarity was no mere word or slogan to shout at the Union Hall. Time and again they proved their commitment to Union solidarity by suffering whatever strike was required to help their fellow Unionists. On the docks, as Harry said, they were all the same. Regardless of the color of their skin, everyone had the same red blood in their veins, so they were all brothers under the skin. At first they used to meet in secret at the block, as they called it, up at the corner of Kuhio and Kalanianiole. It was a combination pool hall and grocery store run by their old friend James K. Aloha, who would years later with their political support be the state's first lieutenant governor. Starting with the younger men who had less to lose and more to gain, Harry moved quickly. His seaman's education combined with a local style gained him respect and credibility. By May of 1936, the Hilo longshoremen were 100% organized. Even their Big Five employer, C. Brewer, had to concede as much to the National Labor Relations Board. As the longshoremen grew stronger, the organizing branched out. They had even organized an active women's auxiliary among the wives of the longshoremen. Based on similar West Coast auxiliaries, the Hilo women were strong supporters of their husbands' efforts and would not hesitate to be at their sides in the troubled times that lay ahead. Nor were longshoremen content to relax after having done for themselves what had surely seemed impossible. Their example had stimulated similar efforts by other groups of workers whom they then helped to organize as well, just as they preached the importance of solidarity and togetherness among the other Hilo workers. They realized their own need for the resources of affiliation with a strong mainland union. They had first reached out to the American Federation of Labor, but were disheartened by that organization's response, which inquired as to the American NES, more militant Congress of Industrial Organizations, and the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, which was then deeply involved in an internal struggle between its East and West Coast locals. It was, after all, natural that they would be so drawn to the CIO, for the Hilo longshoremen were also committed to the belief that their best hope for a better life was expressed in the CIO motto, "Organize the unorganized." By the summer of 1937, with the help of the longshoremen, Hilo had the following unions: Hilo Laundry Workers Association, Hilo Longshoremen's Association, Hilo Kanak Association, Hilo Clerks Association, Hilo Railroad Association, and the Honuapo Longshoremen's Association. They had moved from the block to more permanent quarters in a new office in Waiakea Town. Footnote: that building, at 1383 Kamehameha Avenue, with the rest of Waiakea, was unfortunately completely destroyed along with all the locals' early records and charters in the tidal wave of April 1, 1946. Today the spot is the site of the third hold of Country Club Hawaii's golf course. Footnote end. And, with no outside assistance, were standing proudly on their own and fully involved in the day-to-day business of modern collective bargaining. By October the dust had settled on the ILA organization. Harry Bridges was the leader of the new CIO-affiliated International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, and in Hawaii the three locals ready and waiting to be chartered were Kauai, Local 135, Hilo, Local 136, and Honolulu, Local 137. Honolulu, organizing Inter-Island, II. The Inter-Island Steam Navigation Co. Limited had been controlled since 1925 by Matson Navigation and Castle and Cook Limited the days before commercial airline transport between the islands. Its ships carried virtually all passenger and light freight traffic. It operated 4 steamers, the SS Humu'ula, SS Hawaii, the SS Waialele, and the SS Hualalai, and was the main artery of commerce between all the main islands in the Hawaiian chain. In 1937 it was the primary object of union organizing campaigns on Oahu by several unions including both CIO and rival AFL affiliates. Spurred on by the dramatic gains made by West Coast workers as the result of the 1934 maritime strike as well as by the achievements of their brother Hilo longshoremen, the Honolulu workers were now eager to win similar rights on Oahu that would bring the whole territory into the same fold. By January 20th, the newly organized Inland Boatmen's Union, IBU, a CIO affiliate, had announced that the crews of the Waialele and Hualalai were nearly 100% organized. Out of a possible 215 unlicensed personnel, they had signed up 195, the great majority of them Hawaiians. 7. They would be joined by about 45 stevedores signed up by the Honolulu local of the ILWU. Also in January of 1937, 3 established AFL craft unions organized a metal trades council to combine their efforts organizing the workers at Inter Island Dry Docks and Honolulu Iron Works. These AFL members consisted of boilermakers, machinists, and carpenters, and, though they were mostly haole, footnote, a Hawaiian word meaning literally foreigner, in modern usage it refers only to Caucasians, footnote end. To begin with, by 1937 they had been integrated to the extent that they represented numbers of Hawaiians, Portuguese, and Orientals as well. By November 22, the NLRB had certified the Metal Trades Council as the legitimate bargaining representative for 174 employees of the Inter-Islands dry docks and machine shops. The situation was now ripe for a unified coalition approach to their common problem. The ILWU president was Jack Kawano, while Albert Kaiwi, Basil Mayo, and Folinga Fafata lead the IBU, and coordinating the overall CIO strategy was Hawaii's newly appointed regional director Edward Berman. On the AFL side, the Metal Trades Council president was H. Stubbs, but just before this coalition could be worked out, a new AFL local was chartered by the International that put all other plans on hold. The Honolulu Waterfront Workers Association, HWWA, chartered June 1937 started an organizing drive that was clearly designed to challenge the established CIO representation. Its president, Charles B. Wilson, seemed to be distributed both by the local AFL and CIO unionists as a possible tool of the employer's efforts to avoid dealing with anyone. The classic employer tactic, divide and rule, was all too familiar to them. Whether that was his intention or Inter-Islands or both is hard to say, but undeniably that is the very effect Wilson's drive had. Through the opening months of 1938 a regular free-for-all ensued as organizers from the HWWA, the Sailors Union of the Pacific, SUP, and the Marine Firemen, Oilers, Bartenders and Wipers Association, MFOWWA, wrestled each other for the ILWU and IBU Inter-Island workers. Finally, disgusted with the company delays and the resulting jurisdictional raids of the AFL's HWWA, the IBU struck Inter-Island the week of February 4th to force an end to the squabbles and demonstrate its true strength and support. Of the 215 crewmen on 3 ships, 180 walked off, and the matter was at last settled. In the end, Wilson was only able to pick up a handful of dry dock workers, not otherwise represented by the Metal Trades Council. With recognition issues out the way, the stage was finally set for the real negotiations to begin. Part 2. The Inter-Island Strike. As the bargaining began with a most reluctant employer, the 3 unions, the IBU, the ILWU, and the MTC were in complete agreement on the 2 major issues. 1. Parity or equity of wages and conditions with the West Coast workers, and 2. The closed or union shop or some kind preferential hiring arrangement. But Hawaii employers were committed to fight the issue of wage parity or mainland wage standards in every industry as a matter of principle. No matter how well their businesses were doing or how enormous the profits, they adamantly resisted the very notion that local workers should be compared to their mainland counterparts. That lower standard or pay in the standard of pay in the islands was jealously guarded as their competitive edge that would ensure profitability through whatever economic times might lie ahead. Inter-Island was having a particularly difficult time with this issue. The public was aware that the company's years of monopoly control of the light freight traffic had resulted in exorbitantly high rates. In the years previous to the strike, net profits and stock dividends generally exceeded 10%, while most local people felt that service was not particularly good and compared poorly to cheaper mainland lines. The question of wage parity, though, was somewhat different for the different II workers. At first glance, the seamen seemed to be making slightly more than some of the West Coast workers, but their working conditions were more severe, and resulted in an actual loss of take-home pay. On the West Coast, the seamen had a regular work week of 5.5 days. The II men worked 9-hour days 6 or 7 days a week with irregular and inconvenient hours at less than the overtime rates of their West Coast brothers. And on the coast there were special premium rates for difficult or dangerous cargoes as well as meal and rent allowances, all of which left the II men lagging behind the mainland standard. For the metal trades workers the issue was more dramatic. The II dry dock workers made 20% to 25% less than men doing the same work at Pearl Harbor. The second major issue, that of the preferential hiring haul, was, like the wage issue, one that hinged on the ideas of recognition and dignity. Just as the unions were insistent that their work be given the same value and remuneration as mainland workers receive, they also sought control over the greatest weapon the employers had used to fight the union. Since the early days of the movement, Unionists had seen the employers fire then blacklist their best organizers and representatives. Longshoremen in particular suffered from the shape-up hiring system whereby for each new shipment ready for unloading, all the workers, the veterans along with young new applicants, had to muster in a humiliating lineup like so much meat at an auction before the employer, hoping to be picked out. Sometimes they stood for hours, only to be turned away in the end. Often they wasted the whole day for only an hour or two of paid work. More often than not, men would try to improve their bid for work by tendering little bribes to the timekeeper. Japanese sake during Prohibition days. A chicken, or even a straight cut of their wages was likely to be required. Or, if a man were a good athlete, he stood a better chance of getting work since the company fielded its own sports teams. These were the arbitrary and capricious ways men got jobs on the waterfront. And, if someone had been identified as a union member, all the bribes he could put together wouldn't help. Any labor union that hoped to survive would have to stop the shape-up and prevent the II and the Big Five from being able to continue to use the blacklist against them. In 1934, the West Coast dockworkers had won a closed-shop hiring haul that put an end to that kind of management harassment, and the Hawaiian workers were determined to get the same protection from Inter Island. II went all out to sway public opinion against the union on this issue. They ran full-page advertisements in the local papers on May 12th and 13th, which were, later in the strike, followed by a front-page editorial in the Advertiser on July 29th, each denouncing the closed shop. In March and April of 1938, the unions tried negotiating individually, but the Inter-Islands position was unequivocal. Between April 19th and the 26th, the II negotiators rejected each union's proposals. Strike votes were taken, and it started to become clear that II was ready to take them on. From April to May, though the company was in sound economic condition, it actually laid off nearly 150 dry dock workers, writing the union that the company sincerely hopes and will endeavor to avoid any reduction in personnel or rates, but certainly cannot at this time entertain proposals which will add to the company's expenses without considering corresponding curtailment. In the face of this kind of harassment, the most incredible alliance was forged. The IBU and the ILWU were CIO unions that only recently had been locked in an organizing battle for survival with the AFL-affiliated HWWA. The three unions of the Metal Trades Council also belonged to the AFL, which the CIO unionists generally regarded as their bitter rival. But now they could see the times required unity in dealing with Inter-Island. The past had shown them all too many examples of strikes broken by the employer's ability to play one group off another. Though their unions were not divisible along racial lines, they knew the same, divide and rule. Strategy would be used against them and doom their efforts as well. On April 26, the same day the II rejected the last of the union proposals. The Star Bulletin reported, a union spokesman said the ILWU and IBU have agreed to present a united front with the Trades Council, an AFL affiliate. No union, the spokesman said, will sign an agreement until each of the other two unions has reached an understanding with the company. Of the 500 strikers that would go out together, about half were in the metal trades and half in the CIO affiliates. For their own survival, they both agreed to join in a united front, whereby each would enjoy an equal voice in all their mutual deliberations throughout the dispute. They spent another full month trying to negotiate a settlement, neither the unions nor the Inter-Island willing to give on these two issues. On May 26th at 4 p.m. members of the Honolulu-based ILWU and IBU walked out, followed 2 days later by the MTC boilermakers, carpenters, machinists, and electricians. They set up pickets in front of the company piers and dry docks as well as its offices. For the first 3 weeks, the strikers were in good spirits and hopeful for a quick settlement. But II was not in this alone either. As only a strand in the Big Five web of corporate control, Inter-Island soon demonstrated to the unions that they were matched up against the massive resources of Hawaii's power elite. With the assistance of federal mediator William Strench, the parties did get back together, and the union submitted some counter-proposals on the hiring hall issue, but the company was adamant and rejected each new proposal as it had already rejected the entire concept. After the third week, the company began to recruit non-union replacement workers, now determined to break the strike entirely. The mood of the strikers darkened and several sporadic episodes of violence occurred when the company announced the proposed sailing of the SS Hawaii manned by scabs and deserters, the worst involving the beating of 2 taxi drivers who, it was believed, were driving strikebreakers to the piers. The press, ever eager to vilify the unions, seized the opportunity to unleash a torrent of bad publicity which had, at least, the one good effect of tightening the union's discipline so as to stop any further incidents. But things were going from bad to worse for the strikers. Since the company had pulled together enough scabs to get a boat or two into service, the unions had decided to fall back somewhat and draw their line at the return of the two larger ships, the SS Waialele and the SS Hualalai. The smaller ones, the SS Hawaii and the SS Humu'ula, came back online with limited passenger and mail service and little union resistance. By July, though, it was apparent that both of the union's major issues were now lost. The unions may well have been ready to give up the strike altogether and return to work, but the II officials were then no longer content with merely winning the strike. They were committed to break the unions entirely. The chief bargaining issue of this last phase of the strike became whether or not striking union men would have the right to go back to work at all. As bad as things were going, the union men were renewed by that intransigence and again prepared to take their stand against the two big ships. For its part, Intura Island on July 6 was ready to put the SS Waialele in dry dock preparatory to setting her back in regular service. The dynamite plot. The day after the SS Waialele went to the dry docks, the Honolulu police got a call of a plot to blow her up. A careful search did not reveal anything, but a few days later, Charles B. Wilson, the disgruntled president of HWWA, informed Merton B. Carson, the acting manager of Intura Island, of enough details to convince him there was a real possibility of danger. Carson called the police, who immediately went to Wilson's home where they found 26 sticks of dynamite and 4 caps. It was Charles Wilson who had earlier been suspected by the IBU and ILWU of trying to organize a company union. Now he was mysteriously involved in a failed plot to dynamite the ship his CIO rivals and AFL brothers were striking. The end result, of course, served only to discredit the strikers, who had, since the taxi driver's incident, strenuously sought to control the growing anger and frustration of their members so as not to incite public opinion against their cause. An assigned article in the union's newspaper, The Voice of Labor, entitled, "We Accuse," echoing Zola, the co-conspirators Wilson had named, unanimously disavowed his entire scheme. It doesn't make any sense that a labor leader who was furnishing scabs to the company and who has been aided and abetted by the company in organizing his union would take into his confidence men he knows distrust him on matters of such a desperate nature. Conspiracy charges were brought against all of the men Wilson named, but Judge Harry Steiner dismissed the charges when the prosecution was unable to establish that any of them had been working with Wilson at all. In the end, it appeared to be just another example of the framing of labor leaders on false charges, reminiscent of the 1924 charges leveled against Pablo Manlapit, leader of the Filipino plantation strikes. The dynamite plot, though later discredited, gave the press in the last weeks of the strike ample occasion to lambaste the union and the cause of the strikers. Part 3. Provocation. To fully understand the events that occurred on the morning of August 1st, 1938 on the Hilo wharves, we must look back to what happened on the docks 10 days earlier on Friday, July 22nd. After 2 months of little or no cargo service to Hilo or the other neighbor island ports, a great deal of pressure had built up on the company to bring her two main carriers, the Waialele and the Hualalai, back online and restore full cargo services to the neighbor island merchants, whose businesses had, of course, been hard hit. The strike was clearly winding down. By mid-July, the Honolulu unions had given up most of their major demands, but with the aid of its Big Five support, Intura Island maintained its tough stance in the hope of breaking the unions completely. So on July 19th, Intura Island announced restoration of the Waialele's cargo service to Kauai, Maui, and Hilo. What they didn't foresee was the sympathetic reaction of the Kauai and Hilo unionists. It must be emphasized that this was not a question of self-interest on the longshoremen's part. Intura Island's cargo was traditionally loaded by its own crews, so the current strike was not one in which either the Kauai or the Hilo workers had a personal stake. The issue for them, quite simply, was the basic union principle that an injury to one is an injury to all. The Hilo longshoremen had long before been recognized by C. Brewer, so the outcome of the Honolulu union's action against Intura Island would not profit them at all. But they looked upon the Honolulu workers as their union brothers and sisters and were, therefore, committed to help in whatever way they could. Of the 3 Hilo piers in operation on the morning of July 22nd, 2 were being worked by Brewer longshoremen when the Waialele was scheduled to come in. On Pier 3, 4 gangs with nearly 50 men were working the Matson freighter Makua, while a similar number was working the Maliko on Pier 1. They arranged with the Brewer agent, Mr. Armitage, to take a few hours off to peacefully demonstrate in support of the II strikers. Coincidentally, Hilo's chief law enforcement officer, Sheriff Henry K. Martin, was aboard the Waialele on his return from Honolulu. He and a few other members of the Hilo Police Department had been there competing in a law enforcement officers' pistol tournament. The acting harbor master, Captain Hasselgren, had heard of the Union's plans to demonstrate, and decided to close the wharves under his emergency authority to head off any difficulties. As the Attorney General's report would later note, he did this under Section 11, Item 4 of the Rules of the Board of Harbor Commissioners, which provides that no person shall enter upon a wharf so closed without permission of the harbor master. At his request, therefore, Deputy Chief Pakel and Lieutenant Charles Warren with about 8 men roped off the area going to Pier 2 and prepared to deal with what they expected would be no more than a relatively small Union demonstration. But by 9:10 when the ship came in, a large crowd of bystanders and members of the public had already gained access to the wharf and were gathering by the pier. As the longshoremen turned out for their demonstration, unarmed and mixed with a considerable group of people from the general public, including women and children, the Unionists certainly assumed they should have the same right of access to the pier as the rest. The whole crowd moved toward the ship, as the longshoremen proceeded to shout at the Waialele crew in an effort to persuade them to quit scabbing. No attempt was made to prevent any work from being done, but, as the newspapers noted, they did boo and jeer at the crew. At this point, Lieutenant Charles Warren decided that the demonstration had gone too far. He went to his car and took out a tear gas bomb and, without authorization from the sheriff or deputy sheriff who were both present, lobbed it into the middle of the crowd. His bomb exploded in the face of an 11-year-old child, Onsen Kim, who had to be rushed to the hospital. At that, someone yelled, "Bong," and the crowd began to stampede for safety, trampling 3 other small children. Ironically, the tear gas actually dispersed only the non-Union bystanders and spectators. The longshoremen, for the most part, remained and were more adamant than before. For the next hour or more, Harry Kamoku, as leader of the longshoremen, met with Thomas Stratian, local manager of Inter Island, to work out an agreement. Considering how close he thought the Honolulu strikers were to capitulation, Stratian must, no doubt, have been amazed at the determination of the Hilo men, and decided it was little use running the risk of this kind of a demonstration as long as the strike was still on. Whatever Aya's strength might have been in Honolulu, Hilo was a different matter. According to James Mattoon of the Clerks' Union, with whom Harry talked just after that meeting, he and Stratian had come to a gentleman's agreement, whereby Stratian had agreed that the Waialele would not unload the balance of its Hilo cargo nor would the company return cargo service to Hilo, if the Union would agree not to demonstrate against its mail and passenger service. After unloading only its mail, passengers, and some automobiles, the Waialele left for Honolulu that night with 500 tons of cargo still on board. Considerable debate would result over the exact nature of that Kamoku Stratian gentleman's agreement over the next 10 days. Stratian would later state that he only told Kamoku there would be no more service to Hilo until he could be guaranteed adequate protection for the ship's crew and passengers. There is no doubt that the Union leadership all believed Stratian had, in fact, promised to restrict cargo service to Hilo for the duration of the strike. According to the Associated Press announcement on the 22nd, the Inter Island Steam Navigation Co. announced today that its ships will avoid Hilo until there is assurance there will be no display of violence. The company made the announcement following receipt of news of the Waialele demonstration and cancelled the previously announced plan to return the Waialele and Humu'ula to regular service. The Waialele was to be in regular service with her departure Monday at 5 p.m. for Hilo. It should be noted that in the subsequent investigation by Territorial Attorney General Hodgson, no violence was found to be attributable to any of the Union demonstrators. The only violent actions taken, on both the 22nd and later on August 1st, were official police actions, notwithstanding the press insinuations to the contrary. In regard to the controversy between what would later be the different Union and management interpretations of that Kamoku Stratian agreement on July 22nd, Hodgson concluded, a bargain arrived at under such circumstances would of course have no binding effect. It seems very unlikely that a local agent with limited authority would, especially under such circumstances, give the assurance mentioned by the labor union people. However, irrespective of what Mr. Stratian's representations were, I believe that the labor union leaders conveyed their interpretation or misinterpretation to the union memberships. It is curious, though, that he was able to come to such conclusions. When the transcript of his interrogation of Kamoku does not contain a single question relating to Kamoku's meeting with Stradion, Hodgson's report has generally been praised and esteemed over the years as a most thorough and objective presentation of the incident. But it is only recently that the actual statements and other evidence Hodgson collected has been available for examination and analysis. This problem with the questioning of Kamoku is one of a number of flaws that, taken collectively, begin to cast doubt on the purity of Hodgson's inquiry. In this instance, for example, it seems just as reasonable to conclude there was a problem of communication between Stradion's terminology and Kamoku's style, which was, after all, developed through his relationship with brewer representatives, more accustomed to discussions with a union, or that Stradion was simply too inexperienced to negotiate and did, in fact, mistakenly exceed his authority, then sought to retract or vitiate his former concessions. But, whatever the cause, it seems grossly unfair to conclude that Kamoku would just make up his version of that agreement, which is what Hodgson's remarks imply. For a few days, though, immediately after the Waialele returned to Honolulu, there was no dispute. Life went back to normal with Inter Island preferring not to aggravate the tensions in Hilo. But then yet another party was to enter the contest and escalate the conflict once again. The Hilo Chamber of Commerce, as representative of the merchants, was no longer content to wait out the strike in Honolulu while their stocks and inventories dwindled to nothing. Their board met on July 26th and decided to call a special public meeting the following day in order to persuade Sheriff Martin and Stradion of Inter Island to agree to bring the Waialele back. On July 27th, even as the chamber was holding its so-called public meeting, footnote, as Harry Kamoku was to point out, the meeting was little more than a regular chamber meeting, attended almost exclusively by those affected members of the Chamber of Commerce. Footnote end. More trouble attended the Waialele on Kauai. As she pulled into Na Wili Wili, another crowd of about 150 longshoremen turned out to jeer and boo the scab crew, even going so far as to cut the ship's lines to the pier. The day after the meeting was held in Hilo, the headline of the Tribune Herald, whose general manager, Kenneth Biley, was himself a member of the chamber, proclaimed the chamber's position: resumption of II services sought. The 1-hour meeting at the chamber's offices was called, as Hodgson correctly points out, to give expressions to sentiment favorable to the resumption of inter-island sailings and to put Sheriff Martin directly on the spot. Stradion maintained that no service would be restored without guarantees of protection. The sheriff, as might be expected, assured the merchants that he would protect the Waialele if it were to come back. In answer to their concerns, the sheriff read from a letter he had just sent to Stanley Kennedy, II President and General Manager in Honolulu. I gave my guarantee and assurance to Mr. Stradion that full protection will be afforded, and wish to five you that same assurance in order that normal commercial traffic can be resumed as soon as possible. Preparations are going ahead to enlist an adequate armed police, including reserves, in order to guarantee the foregoing protection. So it seems this meeting was held after decisions had already been made. Sheriff Martin had already been reached, and Inter Island had apparently already made some kind of commitment to recommence its service. The sheriff explained, the police underestimated the waterfront situation in Hilo last Friday. Since the steamer had left Honolulu peacefully on the preceding day, the Hilo police did not anticipate any trouble here. We have no alibi to offer at this time for the unfortunate incident at the waterfront, but I can assure you that the next time a steamer comes here we will be fully prepared. We will have all passengers and freight unloaded under the protection of police guns. Also at the meeting was the longshoremen's leader Harry Kamoku. When he was asked to state his views in the Lion's Den, Kamoku boldly reminded the chamber that despite their intention of holding a public meeting, what was convened was little more than a regular meeting of the chamber itself, and that they were receiving only one side of the issue. He described the plight of the II workers and admonished them, we are fighting for our living while you businessmen are thinking only of your profits. He ended by warning them of the consequences of their position. Our union policy is no violence. We instruct our men not to go in for violence. The strike is now coming to a close and we don't want this body here to interfere in our fight. We want you to keep a hands-off policy. If not, we don't know what might happen. Though this admonition caused quite a stir, the chamber seemed to perceive it only as a threat that the union would resort to violence after all. They were convinced it was now properly a matter for the police, so they continued their pressure on the sheriff. The following day the paper announced the return of the Waialele to Hilo, which was purportedly a decision made by General Manager Kennedy in view of the sheriff's promised protection, Running next to that front page story was a companion announcement of Sheriff Martin's call for volunteers to act as special deputies when the ship comes in. Those who register as volunteer special deputies will have their names on file at the police station, and whenever they are needed they will be summoned by the sounding of the siren. On July 30th and 31st, Inter Island ran its usual notice in the Hilo Tribune-Herald to shippers and passengers that the SS Waialele would be sailing for Honolulu via Lahaina on Monday. And on the 31st, Sheriff Martin posted an additional notice in the paper forbidding parking on the streets by the wharves, and advising friends and relatives of passengers to await their passengers at the airport. The notice, it should be remarked, did not close the wharf or forbid general access to the piers. This raises a very important question that, to some extent, challenges the traditional interpretation of the incident. It has generally been accepted as a given that the Union demonstrators were actually breaking the law by defying the sheriff's orders to remain off the wharf. In the HEA report on the inter-island strike, Rianecki noted, although normally the public has the right of access to territorial piers, under Section 11, Item 4 of the Rules of the Board of Harbor Commissioners, the demonstrators were deliberately committing a misdemeanor. Hodgson as well reports that the Unionists knew they were not supposed to cross the sheriff's line, knew there would be violence, but proceeded with the demonstration anyway. On Friday and Saturday, July 29th and 30th, the Hilo newspapers carried stories of the plans which the police were perfecting. It was stated that the plans involved the closing of Kaulani and Naole and Silva streets at designated points. It was also stated that a picket fence would be erected at the place where Kuhio Road joins the closing of Kaulani and Naole Street, that a cordon of police officers would be stationed in the vicinity of the wharves, that those who had business on the wharves should secure passes from the police department. Actually, there were only two official police notices that appeared in the Hilo Tribune-Herald on the 29th and 31st of July. The first was a call for volunteer, special deputies, to register at the police department. The second was a notice that parking in the area would be prohibited and that passengers should be picked up at the airport. There is no mention in these notices of the closure of the harbor or of the need to secure special passes from the police department. Even the news stories, which could hardly have been expected to serve as legal notification, contain no reference to Hasselgren's order or to the police passes Hodgson describes. Interviews with several of the demonstrators, furthermore, indicated that they had received the opinions that their planned demonstration was legal, since the sheriff did not have authority on territorial wharves, nor was the harbor master within his rights to restrict access of the wharves to some but not to others. Footnote: Joe Rocher recalls a meeting with Harry Kamoku and Territorial Deputy High Sheriff Walker, who assured them that the county police did not have authority unless called in by the governor. See also Part 4, p. 30 for the advice given to the Unionists by Judge Martin Pence. Footnote end. Sheriff Martin, it would seem, had his own misgivings about his authority on the wharves and described in his statements to Hodgson how he sought advice from Gordon Scruton. Footnote: a Canadian by birth, Scruton had come to Hawaii 15 years earlier to work as a reporter for the Advertiser. Most of the surviving Unionists felt he was behind the Chamber's anti-union position. Later he would return to Honolulu as the personnel director for E.E. Black, then the head of the General Contractors Association. Footnote end. Executive Secretary of the Hilo Chamber of Commerce, who advised the sheriff to assure himself by consulting the county attorney, W. Beers. Mr. Beers told the sheriff to get a letter from Acting Harbor Master Hasselgren making his request for police assistance a matter of record. Hasselgren quickly complied, though, as Hodgson notes, at no time prior to delivery of this and at no time prior to the firing at the wharf on August 1st did Captain Hasselgren inform the Board of Harbor Commissioners of what transpired at the Chamber of Commerce meeting. No request was made to the Territorial High Sheriff for assistance. While this short paragraph in Hodgson's report implies that Hasselgren may have exceeded his proper authority, and perhaps dragged Sheriff Martin along with him, Hodgson does not explore the issue or comment on how this might have affected the propriety of the Union's demonstration. His interviews did, however, reveal another feature of this question which was totally omitted from his report. Though Hasselgren had not communicated with the Board of Harbor Commissioners, Louis S. Kane, chairman of that board, had been following the story through the press reports in the Honolulu papers. Ironically, Kane finally wired Hasselgren just as the police began shooting into the crowd. In a wire dated August 1st, 10 a.m., Kane gave Hasselgren the following instructions. Advertiser story today repolicing of pier noted stop. Harbor Board is neutral in strike stop. So long as pier is used by public without interfering with passengers and freight and no disturbance or nuisance committed, no action to be taken by Harbor Board stop. In case of riot, interference with use of dock, or passengers and freight, Then assistance of sheriff is to be requested if you are unable to preserve order. It is not known exactly when he received this wire, whether it was later that day or there at Pier 2 as the shooting was already underway. Surely Hasselgren must have been alarmed and worried to find his supervisors so dramatically indisposed to the strategy he had adopted. In his report to Kane the following day, he had to justify his resort to the police by the following description of the demonstration. The SSY Alele arrived on August 1, 1938, at 9 o'clock a.m., and a mob of approximately 600 men swarmed through the police lines to within 50 feet of the shed on Pier 2, where they finally stopped. The police tried to talk to them and to get them to move on, but they insisted that they were going to rush the shed and board the vessel, which they finally attempted to do. The police opened fire on them, injuring a number, and restored order, and cleared the property of persons intending to create a disturbance. I in no way indicated to the police how they should maintain law and order or what steps they should take. You can see from this explanation of the situation that I have been carrying out the letter and spirit of your wire as well as the rules and regulations of the Board of Harbor Commissioners of the Territory of Hawaii, and at the same time have not taken sides in the labor dispute. That this is a deliberately distorted account of what actually happened August 1st shall be seen in the next chapter. If on the other hand this were generally what happened that day, it is likely that Sheriff Martin could have corroborated Hasselgren's depiction. Instead, in the last few lines of Hodgson's first interview of Sheriff Martin, the sheriff expressed an entirely different assessment. Question: did the harbor master inform you that he had a wire from the harbor board that they were neutral and the crowd had a right to go on the pier so long as they would not destroy any property? Answer: after this thing had happened. If that was given to me prior to that, we would have walked home. But why didn't the Attorney General cite any of this in his report? The omission of any reference to these findings casts serious aspersions on the reliability of Hodgson's report and suggests a deliberate intention to cover up any territorial culpability for the shootings. Police preparations. Notwithstanding the doubts Sheriff Martin was having about the jurisdiction of his authority, on the 28th of July he directed Deputy Sheriff Puette, whose name in Hawaiian means escape, to work out a detailed strategy for the armed protection he had promised the chamber, in an attempt to account for whatever the unions might be planning. Puette's strategy called for a series of progressively more violent lines of defense that would begin at the highway entrance to the waterfront and end at the Waialele, where she would be tied up at Pier 2, to avoid the problem they experienced on its last visit, when longshoremen simply walked over from the neighboring piers that were being worked. They arranged for the other two piers to be closed down also. That same day, July 28, patrolmen were taken to the National Guard firing range where they were shown the difference between the buckshot and birdshot cartridges they would be given, and they also demonstrated the difference between firing straight on at a target as opposed to shots ricocheted off the ground in front of the target as was recommended in riot situations. Puette then delegated command of the different divisions. Deputy Chief Nahale would be in charge of the club detail of officers who would be responsible for the basic crowd control problems of an ordinary nature. Fire Department Chief Johnson Kahili would bring a fire truck and fire hoses to shoot at the demonstrators as needed, and Lieutenant Charles Warren was assigned command of the tear gas and gun details. Tear gas Warren. The choice of Lieutenant Warren for this crucial assignment is perplexing. Born in Honolulu as Charles Joseph Warren, Jr., he was a rather dark-skinned young Hawaiian whose father had been a servant to King Kalakaua, a member of the provisional troops that overthrew the monarchy, and a police captain before him. Charles, Jr., had served in the army during World War I and held rank in the Hilo unit of the National Guard. He had been often on the police force at Hilo for about 8 years since he joined in 1925. From all the indications, he had the complete trust and confidence of the sheriff, which is somewhat surprising considering his previous record. Just a week and a half earlier it had been Warren who had taken it upon himself, without the authorization of his superiors who were present, to blindly throw a tear gas bomb into a crowd composed as much of curious bystanders as of the longshoremen he was targeting. Flaunting Tear Gas Warren, as some were beginning to call him, before these same demonstrators with so much authority and command must certainly have been regarded by the Unionists as a form of provocation. But Warren already had a reputation for impetuous and uncontrollable outbursts. Local attorney Martin Pence, who was at the time also a second judge of South Hilo District Court, told Hodgson of a string of episodes in which Warren had been found guilty of police brutality. He stated that Warren had arrested a boy and given him a brutal beating. The boy was later represented by Judge Metzger when Judge Metzger was practicing law, and that boy had received a judgment in the sum of about $400 for the injuries he received. Mr. Pence further stated that a client of his had been arrested by Warren, and when the two of them arrived at the police station, Warren grabbed the man, twisted his arm, and threw him against the wall, so that his face hit the wall, breaking his glasses and making a cut over one of his eyes. Later, Warren paid for the glasses. He further stated that some boxing contest held in Hilo. A riot occurred while Warren was present, and that Warren did nothing to stop the riot with the exception of setting up a tear gas bomb. Warren left the hall and after walking some distance to the street clubbed a person on the street. Attorney General Hodgson scrupulously avoided drawing any official conclusions as to the guilt or responsibility of anyone involved in that day's events. And yet, beneath this veneer of objectivity, there are numerous instances revealing his personal support of the sheriff. But Warren is another matter. Even Hodgson leaves us wondering how differently the day might have ended without Warren's prominent role. Part 4. The Hilo Massacre. In view of the elaborate police plans they heard were being drawn up and the daily stories in the Tribune Herald of the impending return to service of the SS Waialele, the Hilo Union members called for a joint meeting on Sunday, July 31st at the Hilo Boathouse near Coconut Island to consider their plans. Present were about 250 members of the ILWU, Local 136 longshoremen and warehouse men, ILWU, Local 136 clerks, ILWU, Local 136 Ladies Auxiliary, United Laundry Workers, Local 832, the Quarry Workers International Union of North America, Branch 284, United Automobile Workers of America, Local 586, and a Teamsters Local of the Hilo Transport Workers Association. Harry Kamaku presided over the meeting at which there was considerable discussion over what they should do in response to the return of the Waialele the next day. They were all told of Stratian's gentleman's agreement with Kamaku from the 22nd. Feeling was strong that some kind of a demonstration would be necessary. David Furtado, a key organizer of the ILWU clerks unit, had picked up details of the police plans from a fellow National Guardsman and from his sister, a secretary in Doc Hill's office. He told them all how the police were planning to use tear gas, fire hoses, clubs, and possibly riot guns if they attempted to get down by the pier. Earlier that weekend, Harry and several others had tried to talk to Gordon Scruton of the Chamber of Commerce. After calling the sheriff for advice, Scruton would only tell them that his official statements would be published in paid advertisements in the paper. They should believe only what they read in those notices. Though this formal rebuff was duly recorded by Attorney General Hodgson, unaccountably, he later criticizes the Unionists because labor union leaders made no such effort. No attempt was made to sit down and frankly discuss a situation which was rapidly becoming dangerous. Also that weekend they paid a call on Judge Martin Pence for his opinion on their right to demonstrate on the wharf. Judge Pence, one of the island's handful of Democrats who had dared to cross swords with the Big Five by representing union clients, was willing to advise them manuahi, free of charge. As Hodgson records, he told them that the harbor master did have the right to close the harbor, but he also told them they had as much right to be on the piers as anyone else so long as they conducted themselves in a peaceful manner. As they heard all these reports at their meeting on the 31st, consensus was quickly reached to proceed with a mass, joint demonstration. There was some concern about the women participating, in view of the possibility of a confrontation with armed police, but the women themselves insisted upon their right to attend. Almost 2 months earlier, Teresa Hamaku of the laundry workers had written to the II strikers, "It takes lots of guts to face the whole world, and we know what it means to fight." She and her fellow workers had been through a rough organizing strike the year before, and neither they nor the ladies' auxiliary were willing to back down on their pledges of support to the inter-island workers. At this meeting they also decided that careful precautions must be taken to be sure that their demonstration would remain peaceful, regardless of whatever provocation they might encounter from the police. They were afraid that the police and the newspapers would seize upon the smallest excuse possible to lay the blame on them for any violence. They would meet any police force with passive resistance. Here it must be noted how advanced sociologically their plans were. Of course, Thoreau had conceived of the idea of civil disobedience nearly 100 years before, and Gandhi had first developed the principle of satyagraha, nonviolent civil disobedience, as an organizational strategy during his civil rights campaign in South Africa around 1910. But conventional wisdom has normally credited Martin Luther King with bringing Gandhi's tactic of passive resistance into modern use in America in the late 50s civil rights movement. And yet, here in the territory of Hawaii, clearly, the Hilo Unionists were using passive resistance, per se in 1938, to work out the details of the demonstration and assure there would be compliance with the consensus reached that Sunday. Each of the 7 unions, including the Ladies' Auxiliary, delegated 2 representatives to sit on a special planning committee to consist of Harry Kamoku, ILWU Longshoremen, Bernard Camahel, ILWU Longshoremen, Pascual Ruiz, ILWU Warehousemen, Hidachi Higuchi, ILWU Warehousemen, Joseph Rocha, ILWU Clerks, William Kaluhikaw, ILWU Clerks, Anna Camahel, Ladies' Auxiliary, Lee Kanau, Ladies' Auxiliary, Basil Medeiros, Laundry Workers, Local 832, Norman Garcia, Laundry Workers, Local 832, Gilbert Pereira, Quarry Workers, Number 28422, Richard Kim, Quarry Workers, Number 28422, Leo Kamara, Teamsters, Ben Brown, Teamsters, and, finally, as the group adjourned, they agreed to form up the next morning in front of Kealoha's store, the block at the corner of Kalani Anaole and Silva Streets. Those who were scheduled to work that day should seek time off from their employers. Everyone was to wear their regular work clothes. The committee then met and developed the following specific rules which would be explained to everyone the next morning. No violence of any kind. No weapons or tools that might be mistaken for weapons. No intoxicating liquor. Kealoha to close his bar and anyone smelling of alcohol shall be sent home. No use of profane or obscene language permitted. Only jeering at the Waialele crew allowed. Any police force was to be met with passive resistance. Do not struggle with the police, but just sit or lie down wherever you may be. Do not molest or harass the Waialele passengers getting off the boat or leaving the area with their baggage. Do not interfere with the loading or unloading of any of the cargo or mail. March peacefully down to Pier 2, 8 abreast, men in front and women in back. If police throw tear gas or use their billies, clubs, on the crowd, remain calm and lie down in place until it's safe to get up. Once you get down by the Waialele, sit down throughout the demonstration, so that you won't be accused of rushing the police. To get closer, the back row can move up in front of the front row to gradually edge the crowd forward, non-threateningly. The demonstration would continue until noon, at which time they would all be free to return to their regular work or continue to demonstrate as it pleased them. Regardless of these express goals and guidelines of the demonstration, which did not intend to prevent the unloading of the ship's passengers or cargo, Attorney General Hodgson's investigation continued to focus upon the exact location of the Union's ultimate destination, believing that, if the object of the demonstration was to gain access to the area on the apron of the wharf between the warehouse and the SS Waialele, the attaining of such object would necessarily result in the ship being unable to load or unload cargo which, in turn, would set at naught the sheriff's promise of full protection upon the arrival of the ship. In his interrogations, therefore, much time was spent trying to establish a clear and premeditated Union plan to attain that apron, but the many statements he elicited only pointed to the conclusion that there was no precise target in the committee's plan. Almost all of the Union witnesses attested only to the idea that they were to get as close to the Waialele as would permit their booing and jeering to be heard by the crew. Nevertheless, Hodgson elected to quote in his official report the opinion of longshoreman Kenneth Moniz, who was one of the only witnesses to describe the apron as their goal. Moniz, it must be noted, was not a member of the planning committee, nor was he in any respect an organizer of the day's events. For Hodgson to make so much of Moniz's statement despite the weight of the vast majority of the other Union witnesses on this question suggests the Attorney General was not being entirely unbiased in his analysis. In any case, the effect of Hodgson's conclusions regarding the final goal of the demonstrators would lend support to Hasselgren's rushing the shed depiction and, therefore, justify the sheriff's resort to the use of deadly force. The night before, Sunday night, the police began to assemble at the wharf to be sure that the Union men would not get there before they did. Officers from all over the island, together with about a dozen deputized citizens, were called in and assigned duty to one of the various sections, which besides the club, tear gas and gun details also included a detective squad which would work the boat and passengers, a team of unarmed specials who were friendly with many of the Unionists, and, therefore, assigned to talk them out of whatever they were planning, and a photographic detail to obtain pictures that might possibly be used for future evidence. In all, Hodgson tabulated the total police detail to deal with the demonstration at 68 officers and special volunteer deputies. However, it is possible by cross-referencing testimonies to actually identify by name as many as 74 men. Under the overall command of Deputy Chief Peter Pakel, they set up 2 police lines to stop the progress of the marchers. The first was marked off by a yellow line drawn on the road together with a partial picket fence at the top of Kuhio Road where it joins the highway, directly across from Kealoha's store. The block, the second line, the dead line, as Warren called it, was drawn in yellow about 350 feet further down Kuhio. Still quite some ways from the pier, this line was understood by Warren to represent the point beyond which his forces were to be unleashed to drive the Unions back. At his command was a small arsenal of 52 riot guns with bayonets, originally purchased in 1924 on the occasion of the Filipino plantation strike led by Manlapit, 4 Thompson submachine guns, tear gas grenades, and an adequate supply of ammunition including both buckshot and birdshot cartridges for the riot guns. And finally, the Hilo Fire Department was assigned to dispatch a pumping truck and enough firemen as might be needed to repulse the marchers with hoses. Outside of the official police force that was assembling, the Inter-Island Navigation Company had also prepared a squad of its own specials. Under the command of Port Captain Herbert T. Martin, not related to Sheriff Martin, aboard the Waialele was a team of 8 or more thugs that II used like a SWAT team to deal with labor disturbances. Inter-Island was concerned about a repeat of the Na Willy Willy incident in which the hawsers from the ship were cut by the Unionists. Martin revealed to Hodgson that, "I flew to Kauai to break that mess, to straighten that mess out. Yes, I flew to Kauai and got that mess straightened out there, and they had no more trouble over there after that." Indeed, his job was to break the strike and the Union. His Honolulu squad members were not carried as crew on the ship's logs. Their job was apparently to stop any attempt of the Unions to cut the Waialele's lines and to marshal the rest of the crew as necessary to make sure the cargo was properly unloaded at Hilo. They were armed with 50 hickory trundle sticks, a dozen flare or very guns, several of the ship's hoses deployed for use to repel boarders, and, though it was never proven and adamantly denied by Martin, various Hilo witnesses, including police, observed them with police badges and handguns. Nevertheless, as Hodgson notes, the police conducted no investigation, either at the time or afterwards, to determine whether there were armed men on the ship. August 1st, the demonstration begins. The Waialele was expected around 9 a.m., but some of the longshoremen started to gather at the block as early as 6:30 that day. Harry Kamaku was watching from early in the morning and finally spotted her off Tepikeo. The word went out, and by 8:30 a.m. the majority of the Unionists began to arrive, walking down from each different direction. One of the most difficult questions, which even Hodgson was unable to solve precisely, was the exact number of demonstrators that actually were there. Witnesses estimated the crowd anywhere from 80 to 800, with the newspapers' reports running around 500 to 600. One difficulty in getting a reliable figure arises out of the fact that a considerable number of those present were just curious bystanders not related to the Union. Hodgson was inclined to settle on an estimate between 250 and 300. No one seems to have used the many photographs taken that day to actually count heads. Careful study of enlargements of 2 such photos, one taken of the demonstrators as they reassembled after the tear gassing and hosing, and the other taken of the crowd shortly before the firing, revealed a considerably smaller number. In both cases the crowd seemed to be undiluted by onlookers. Separating out the figures established as police, in the first photo there were 169 visible, and in the second about 158 could be seen, with a few more believed to have been outside the camera range. This latter-day photographic analysis is certainly subject to some error, but is likely an indication that even the formerly conservative estimate of 250 was somewhat exaggerated. There is, after all, a natural tendency to exaggerate an opposing force, and it must have been difficult at many points to tell the difference between demonstrators and other members of the general public just there to watch the event as it unfolded. It may well be, therefore, that either the demonstration had thinned by that later stage, or that Hodgson's estimate of the size of the crowd, based entirely on the various statements he collected, was itself exaggerated. It seems most plausible to estimate that the demonstration that day may well have started with about 200 or more Union members, but was thinned considerably after the first tear gassing and was carried out in the main by about 175 members of Hilo's local unions, including about 30 women. Footnote: the women were from the union representing the workers at White Star Laundry and from the ladies' auxiliary, not from Crest Store, as has often been reported. Footnote end. Of this number it is possible to identify by name through the various records just over 100 of them. When the number of shot and wounded later is matched up against this reassessment, it means that a significant percentage of the crowd was, in fact, to fall before police fire. As the crowd began to collect in front of Kealoha's store between 8:30 and 9, the Waialele could be seen coming into her berth. At 9 a.m. she tied up and started to unload, so a small delegation of the Unionists went over to the police line to talk to Sheriff Martin. 2 photographs, later identified as Camera Craft Pictures number 5 and number 6, show this conference. The unions were represented by Harry Kamelku, James Mattoon, Leo Kamara, Bernard and Anna Camahel, Lydia Papalimalui, and a few others. The sheriff was backed up by Wallace Nayop, one of the special deputies, and Deputy Sheriff Pakel. As Sheriff Martin tells it, this is what was said. They told me they wanted to have a demonstration and they wanted to go down to the boat and see who was on that boat. I told them I am sorry the man in charge of the dock has asked me to keep everybody out. Not only you people but others, and not to allow anyone except those who had actual business, as I said. So they said, how about us going down in here? They knew all about this country. They said the wharf line was about here where the railroad. I said, that is impossible. You will be interfering with the passengers. You will be interfering with the freight and passengers coming out. This is a big street. You can march up and down and stage all you want as long as you don't interfere with the people traveling. They also asked the sheriff to bring Stratine out to discuss their agreement from July 22nd, but the sheriff told them he couldn't do that. Harry and the others then went back to the crowd to let them know what they had been told. James Mattoon was appointed to speak to them. He got up on a little hill across from the store and made a speech that the police regarded as inflammatory. According to the statement he made to the Attorney General, this is what he said. I told them that at the previous arrival of the Waialele the agreement Stratine made with us was a gentleman's agreement, and that he did not live up to his word, and had gone right ahead and did what he pleased, and that the sheriff was there on a request of the big shots from Honolulu, and that is why the sheriff was there. And I said, now it is up to the union members. I said, now it is up to you. Question, what did the crowd say? What did the unionists say when you said, now it is up to you? Answer, they clapped, and before I knew it they were marching on. Without any specific order, the crowd formed up and began to march down singing as they went. The more we get together, together, together. The more we get together, the better we'll be. While in the back the women were singing, hail, hail the gang's all here. With Harry Kamelku, his cousin Isaac, Chicken, Kamelku, David, Red, Cupicaw, and Raymond Namau in the front line, they brushed past the sheriff and his deputy, whose feeble shouts of stop, stop, were barely heard even by his own men. Down Kuhio Road they went, quickly approaching Warren's dead line. About 40 feet away from that line on either side, Sergeants Walter Victor and Vernon Stevens with officers Callahan, Kuroyama and Otani were ready with tear gas grenades. As the first of them reached that second line, each of the officers threw 2 or 3 grenades into the crowd until about a dozen had been set off. The crowd broke, with a few running off to the right toward the Pacific Guano and fertilizer buildings, but with most running to the left into the Puhala trees and then onto the park further down the road. As Anna Camahel recalled, we were moving down singing, hail, hail, the gang's all here. And the first thing you know the first group was about to turn at the Intura Island wharf, and we were by the small little house, the railroad house, and we saw smoke coming out. And everybody stopped right there. And somebody yelled, tear gas. It came like fireworks, and I did not know where it was coming from, and I ran to the Puhala trees, and some laid flat on the ground. Some of the braver ones, especially those who had experience in the local unit of the National Guard, had come with their leather work gloves and so were able to pick up the grenades and threw them back at the police or off to the side. One of the officers who tried to throw a grenade back again burned his hand before he realized how hot the grenades become after exploding. In a few minutes, as the air settled, the demonstrators walked down to the little park with the coconut trees, bringing the balance of the crowd closer to Pier 2 than the police had ever calculated. In the meantime, the police were getting the fire truck ready to pump seawater through the hoses to push them all back up to Kalani Ana Ole. But when they tried to operate the hoses, some of the firemen had been blinded by the gas, so they could run the hoses at only about 85 pounds of pressure, less than half of normal. The fire chief's heart didn't seem to be in it anyway. His statement to the Attorney General later would reveal incidentally that Harry and Chicken Kamelku were his nephews, and that he had not even brought enough men to man the 4 hoses they brought if they were used at full pressure. He had left half of his men back at the station to protect the rest of Hilo. In any event, the hoses, not running at full pressure, were totally ineffective, so after a few feeble attempts to spray the demonstrators, which succeeded only in clearing the tear gas out of the air and cooling off the gravel area in front of the pier, that part of the plan was given up. For about 5 minutes the crowd was in confusion and disarray, yet, it should be noted, The police made no attempt to arrest anyone then or at any time during the whole course of the incident. Whether the police were still unconvinced as to their legal authority to make such arrests, or whether they were reluctant on account of the close interrelationships of so many of the Union members with police and fire officials present, is only possible to conjecture, but Sheriff Martin had apparently taken the position that he would try to defuse the situation with Hawaiian style. Ho'omali mali. Footnote: this word, which means to smooth, flatter or mollify, was, in fact, used by several of the witnesses to describe the sheriff's interim tactic for dealing with the unions that day. Footnote end. Unfortunately, this did not seem to be the position Stradian had adopted, and the sheriff was unable to bring the two parties together as had happened on the 22nd. Before long the crowd had recovered sufficiently to reassemble on the gravel area between the park and the pier. They stood there while Harry Kamoku and the others went forward to request again a chance to speak with Stradian. At this point Sheriff Martin actually tried to pull a trick on the Union leaders to assert a clearer and more absolute authority over them. He asked Kamoku, Mattoon and the others to raise their right hands while he started to deputize them, but they all dropped their hands and walked away. With that failed ploy, the sheriff returned to the pier shed. 5 or 10 minutes passed and the Unionists began to sit down in place to wait it out. They played card games like donkey and sang songs hoping that the sheriff would be able to leverage Stradian out for a parley. Special Officer Moody Kelly Ho'omalu, who knew most of the Unionists, recalled, answer, they asked us to go ahead and get the committee, and we, he and the sheriff, said all right. In fact, I suggested that we have the committee from the ship agree about it. So we came in to see Mr. Stradian the manager and told him the boys demand to see the delegates on the ship, by the name of Thompson. He did not say anything. The attorney was standing there. Question: who is the attorney? Answer: Wendell Carlsmith. We asked and he said no. Question: who said that? Answer: Carlsmith. Question: what did you do then? Answer: I pleaded. I talked to him for quite a while before he agreed. He said, I will try. He went out to see Captain Martin of Honolulu, the harbor master, the marshal. Question: so that Carlsmith went to talk to the inter-island port Captain Martin. Answer: yes. Question: he said that nobody from the ship can come off 16. Passengers were loaded into automobiles and driven off to the airport, yet no word came from Stradian. At last the Union formed up again and prepared to move forward, but Deputy Sheriff Pa Kelly warned them that his men were prepared to use force if necessary to stop them from going any farther. At this, the demonstrators seemed to disperse, but were actually breaking up into 3 groups. Most of them collected around the fire truck over by the seawall directly in front of the Waialele. A second group remained on the pavement on Kuhio Road, and a third smaller group spread out into a thin line on the loose gravel area in front of the Pier 2 and Pier 3 shed. The police likewise fanned out to match the rough semicircle that the crowd had now formed. It is interesting to note that in organized demonstrations such as these, the police and the press often seek to characterize the crowd as a mob or riot, while at the same time complaining of the military precision of its actions. It's hard to understand how it can be both, but this is exactly what was to occur in the police and press reports of the Hilo Unionists. The sheriff was obviously caught off guard by the division of the crowd into different sections, particularly since their first impression was that the whole assembly was now dispersing as they had hoped. Sitting down and remaining, by all accounts, quiet and peaceful, the demonstrators remained true to their plans. They were not being violent or abusive. Their language was neither obscene, profane or threatening bodily harm. To get closer to the ship, those in the back walked up and sat in front of those sitting in the front, gradually edging the demonstration close enough to be heard. They occasionally booed at the Waialele's, Scab crew, or at Police Lieutenant Charles Warren or Sheriff Martin for their roles in upholding the interests of the company's owners instead of his own people. But most of the witnesses agreed there were no especially provocative or threatening words or deeds from the demonstrators. As this was happening, the 8-man gang from Honolulu under Captain H.T. Martin's command came out and took up positions on the apron of the wharf directly behind a white picket fence set up to separate the demonstrators from the ship's hawsers. Feeling confident and obviously unthreatened by the demonstrators, they leaned over the fence and glared at the crowd of Unionists. Sheriff Martin saw them and was told by Chief of Detectives Richardson that the crewmen of the Waialele had been overheard talking about the arms they were carrying to deal with the situation. When the sheriff went over there to talk to Port Captain Martin, he was warned, if you can't handle them, I will. This threat was to weigh heavily on the sheriff's mind, and yet he never checked that rumor out, nor did he regard their presence as legally improper. As Hodgson's interrogation revealed, question: will you repeat what he, Port Captain Martin, said? Answer: he came out there and he was practically yelling at me. He said, that mob is getting too close and if you can't handle them, I will take things over and act. Question. What did you say to him? Answer. I told him to go back in the shed. Question. Why didn't you arrest him? Answer. For the same reason. I saw no reason for arresting him at that time. Question. You saw no reason for arresting those men at any time before the firing? Answer. No, I did not, sir. Question. When you say you saw no reason for arresting any of those men before the firing, what do you mean by that? Answer. I presume they were special officers who came with the ship. That is the impression I received, and many others had that idea. As a matter of fact, I saw two with badges just sticking out of their pockets. From everything the sheriff has said, it is clear that his decision to authorize the firing on the crowd was based on his understanding that the ship's crew was, indeed, heavily armed and on the verge of independent action. 2 days after the incident, the sheriff went on the local radio station and explained his actions to the people of Hilo. When the Waialele came to port, she had aboard 84 men, heavily armed. In addition, there were arms intended to repel shore mob attacks. These men were powerful fellows and were prepared to fight. They would have remained on the ship, and at start of any of 500 oncomers attempting to go aboard, they would have been hit on the head and dropped into the bay. I knew that any such clash would result in the death of a large number of local boys. The sheriff seemed to have believed he had something of a Hobson's choice before him, so he decided that if anyone were going to shoot into the crowd, it would be his men with birdshot instead of the full-scale weaponry he imagined to be aboard the ship. He ordered his men to change their ammunition from the larger buckshot to the less harmful birdshot, and set out to disperse the crowd once and for all. Unfortunately, not many of the officers assigned to the gun squad ever heard that order. They were spread out in a semicircle trying to move the demonstrators back. Teresa Hamaku, 19 years old at the time and one of the leaders of the Laundry Workers Union, recalled the way the policemen tried to frighten them. The only time they talked to the police officers was when he said he had orders to shoot. And there was a fellow who belongs to Kokaha, and he said, "If you shot me and I died, who is going to take care of my wife?" And the police officer turned around and said, "I will give her to the Filipinos." And he said, "If you die or get hurt, would you like me to give your wife to the Filipinos?" And he said, "No." That was Officer Cahill. Question. Was he laughing when he said that? Answer. Yes. In fact, these threats had little effect. Teresa herself, after two officers physically dragged her to the back of the crowd, just picked herself up and marched right back to the front where she was, to the applause of her brother Unionists. There are many that have laid the blame for the carnage on Lieutenant Charles Warren. The support for this is the evidence that Lieutenant Warren was the first to come bounding out of the pier shed to where Kai Uratani and Red Cupicall were sitting in the third section of the crowd, stretched out in front of Pier 2 and 3. Smarting from the jeering and taunts directed at him through the morning, Warren told the men, "Okay, you've been calling for Charlie Warren to come out. Well, here I am, and now I'm giving you 3 minutes to get out." With that, he stepped up to Kai Uratani, slapped him on the side of his face with the side of his bayonet blade. Uratani, lying on the ground, began to get up, and Warren then lunged his bayonet into the side of Uratani's back. He described to Hodgson, Kai Uratani, Kai Uratani. Question. Now, as I understand it, you were in a leaning posture, reclining on the ground on your elbow, and Warren came up, and after he pricked you and slapped you with the bayonet on the face, you started to get up. Had you got onto your feet when he stabbed you with the bayonet? Answer. No, I was sitting down. Question. What direction was your back to Officer Warren? Answer. My back was turned to him. Question. Your back was turned to Officer Warren? Answer. Yes. Question. Did you see him move the gun and stab you with the bayonet? Answer. I did not see. Question. You felt something under your arm? Answer. Yes, but before I felt something under my arm, I felt a poke. Question. You felt a poke? Answer. Yes. I did not know I was stabbed. After I felt something running, I looked at my hand and I see blood. Question. You saw blood, and at that time you had your back toward Officer Warren, and you were looking toward the crowd of people. Answer. Yes. Question. After Warren did that to you, did he do anything else? Answer. He went for Tony Moniz. Question. What did he do to Tony Moniz? Answer. Tony Moniz was here on this side, and I saw him just giving a poke with the bayonet at Tony Moniz's trousers. Question. You saw him give a poke with the bayonet at Tony Moniz's trousers? Answer. Yes. Question. Did you see the bayonet go into Tony Moniz? Answer. I saw the bayonet go into Tony Moniz's trousers. Question. What did Tony Moniz do? Answer. He just slipped off. Longshoreman Red Kupuka'a, one of the few Unionists in the demonstration who had a record of minor arrests with the police, shouted out, "Hey, you can't do that." And Warren stepped over to him, swung the butt end of his rifle up into Kupuka'a's jaw and laid him out. Two officers picked him up and moved him back a few feet, then stepped back as Warren took his first shot into the crowd, followed almost immediately by the volleys of the rest of the gun squad until the shooting subsided entirely after about 5 minutes. It was just about 10:20 a.m. In the affray at least 16 rounds of ammunition were fired, 7 birdshot, as Martin had ordered, and 9 buckshot. When it was over, 50 people, including 2 women and 2 children, had been shot. At least one man bayoneted and another's jaw nearly broken for speaking up for his fallen brother. The savagery of the final police attack that day is not easy to explain, especially in view of Sheriff Martin's earlier conciliatory efforts. Perhaps the growing police frustration as they tried to cope with the Union's determined but non-violent demonstration, when it was at last released, created a frenzy. Longshoreman Robert Napahi's testimony to Hodgson tells of just such a melee. Question: do you know who fired in your direction? Answer: no. At that time a woman fell, shot. It was near where I was standing. She called and told me she was shot. I heard the second shooting, rapid fire, and I took cover over her. I covered her. She is my sister-in-law. Question: you got in front of her so she would not get shot again? Answer: yes. Question: and you got shot in the side? Answer: yes. After that I lifted her and I asked her how she feels and I carried her past the fire engine and Harry Camelcoo and my brother gave a hand. While I was moving away, naturally when you pick up a wounded woman you can't move fast. Kahale was there, poking a club, and he said, "Move, keep moving." Oh, I would not say it was Kahale that did the poking. There was a couple more cops there, but there was somebody behind me poking me with a club, saying, "Move, keep moving," and some of them said, "Let them have it." Question: so that you got in front of your sister-in-law and the policeman, so that she would not get shot again? Answer: yes. She fell down and called me and told me she got shot. Shooting again came twice, so far as I know, and instead of standing there I just lie myself right on top of her so that she would not get shot again. Question: was that when you got shot? Answer: yes, that's when I got shot. Question: where were you shot? Answer: in the skull here. Question: now your sister-in-law, what is her name? Answer: Helen Napahi. Question: where was she shot? Answer: in the back. In the afternoon I saw her and asked her where she was shot and she said practically all in the back. 2 days after the shooting, Harry Camelcoo tried to tell the story over the phone to Edward Herman in Honolulu between half-choked sobs. They shot us down like a herd of sheep. We didn't have a chance. The firing kept up for about 5 minutes. They just kept on pumping buckshot and bullets into our bodies. They shot men in the back as they ran. They shot men who were trying to help wounded comrades and women. They ripped their bodies with bayonets. It was just plain slaughter, Brother Berman. Some have said this was all due to Lieutenant Charles Warren, who was personally to blame for losing his temper and starting the shooting on his own authority in the same way he caused the tear gassing of the crowd on the 22nd, 10 days earlier. Sheriff Martin, then, under this interpretation, is believed to have nobly taken the blame for the rash behavior of his lieutenant by insisting that he did give the order to open fire, though he never authorized bayonets or the use of the buckshot. There are, however, some major problems with such a reading of the sheriff's role. A considerable amount of testimony of Union as well as bystander and police witnesses supports the allegation, denied by Martin, that several minutes before Warren's attack, the bystanders and some of the personal relatives of police officers among the Unionists were, in fact, warned to move away or clear the area since the shooting was about to start. Anka Luhaika, for instance, was called aside by her uncle, Officer K. Kella, and removed to the rear of the crowd only moments before the shooting. Other witnesses also testify that Special Officer Seiji Matsu and Deputy Sheriff Pakele went around to the nearby sampans in the harbor and other onlookers by Pier 1, warning them to seek cover or clear the area as the police were about to use force to disperse the crowd. If the shooting had not been premeditated, but simply the result of Warren's outburst, and if Sheriff Martin were just accepting blame, then how is it Pakele, K. Kella and Matsu were in positions to know of the impending danger? And why should Martin so vehemently deny what so many other unbiased witnesses can establish as evidence, that the shooting was by plan and not by accident? Sheriff Martin's testimony is, in fact, riddled with the strangest inconsistencies and denials that seriously impugn his credibility. He insisted that he gave a full and complete order and warning to the Unionists as they began to cross the first yellow line, but even other police witnesses present were unable to support that. He denied that Special Officer Seiji Matsu was assigned to take photographs of the crowd, but the testimony of other specials contradict his denial. And other photographs show Matsu doing just that, and, most unbelievably, at several points, when being questioned by the Attorney General about the guns and ammunition, the sheriff claims, "As a matter of fact, I don't know much about arms and firearms. I have never carried a gun myself, and yet, Just 3 weeks before, the Hilo Tribune-Herald had run his picture holding a pistol with the caption, "The Shooting Sheriff," as he returned from a pistol shooting competition in Honolulu. Most distressing of all is that Attorney General Hodgson did not seem in the least troubled with the sheriff's testimony. Rather, he proclaimed in the prefatory remarks of his report that he believed neither the labor union members as a class nor the police or fire department members as classes attempted deception. Part 5. Aftermath. For all the official pronouncements that the Unionists were violating the law by their demonstration, at no time, either before or after the shooting, did the police even attempt to arrest anyone. The next day, Louis S. Kane, chairman of the Board of Harbor Commissioners, after his untimely attempt to telegram Hasselgren prior to the shooting, publicly affirmed that it was the board's policy to remain neutral in the dispute and thereby delayed further police intervention. In the confusion and uncertainty of the moment, the remaining, uninjured Unionists left the docks Monday afternoon and the Waialele was unloaded without incident. But that night a rally was held at Mo'oeo Park which was attended by a huge crowd. Media estimates of those present range from as many as 3,000 to as few as 500 persons. Harry Kamiku addressed the crowd and described what happened. "The only reason we know for them shooting at us like criminals is that we are members of our chosen unions. The order to shoot came while we were sitting down." He was joined by Teresa Hamiku of the laundry workers, Mrs. Kanau of the Ladies' Auxiliary, and Joe Rocha of the Clerks' Union, who held up a shoe with a bullet hole through it and the blood-spattered remains of Bert Nakano's pants. Not knowing whether Bert or the others had even survived the shooting yet, Rocha appealed to the crowd to help their fallen comrades. Describing the hail of buckshot the police unleashed on them, Rocha told them, "The police say pellets were used and we show you the bullets extracted by physicians." I asked, "Is this justice?" Reminiscent of the violence unleashed in the West Coast strike 4 years earlier. The Hilo shooting closely paralleled the San Francisco police attack of July 5th that had left 2 strikers slain and 100 others wounded. As that day had been called Bloody Thursday, they were already calling August 1st Hilo's Bloody Monday. The local radio station that started to cover the speeches suddenly stopped broadcasting. But this only seemed to stimulate public curiosity, for the crowd swelled as the hours passed and more people from Hilo turned out to hear the rest of the story. Judge Metzger, who had come to hear the speeches, took Joe Rocha by the hand and pressed $25 into his palm for the victims. So ashamed was the judge of the actions of the Chamber of Commerce that he resigned his membership, though he had been a founding member. Reactions started to occur almost immediately. Scores of local union members in Honolulu wrote 1-penny postcards to Attorney General Hodgson in protest. And in Washington, the Secretary of the Interior's Division of Territories and Island Possessions was flooded with complaints including letters from Lee Pressman, General Counsel of the CIO, and Gardner Jackson of Labor's Nonpartisan League. On Tuesday night, Honolulu Unionists purchased radio time from KGMB to disgrace Sheriff Martin's actions and call for an official investigation of the massacre. Sheriff Martin, for his part, prepared a public statement which he delivered on Hilo's KHBC on Wednesday night, which was rebroadcast in Honolulu by KGMB, published in total by the Star Bulletin on Thursday. The sheriff's speech defended his order to shoot into the crowd on the basis that, once the 500 men had gone beyond us, there would have been loss of life and property beyond our imagination. It was to protect them in spite of themselves, hence my action in resorting to the use of shotguns and birdshot. The press. It is difficult so many years after the fact to accurately gauge the reaction of the general public to the sheriff's actions that day or to the cause of the union men and women that prompted their demonstration. Reading the local paper's coverage of the shooting cannot be relied on, since it is clear that the general manager of the Hilo Tribune-Herald, Kenneth Byerly, was not only a member of the Chamber of Commerce himself, but, as can be seen from his own coverage of the events of the last week of July, was a vocal advocate of the Chamber's call for the return of II service and the attendant police intervention. But it was not just the local Hilo paper that reflected that management, chamber bias. As Egan's report to the National Labor Relations Board reminds us, the newspapers are all owned and controlled by the interests who control the Big Five. As noted earlier, the so-called dynamite plot that improperly implicated the Honolulu strike leaders was given considerable play in the papers from July 19th through the 30th, beginning with the police photo of the confiscated cash that was splashed across the front page with pictures of all the union men suspected of complicity. Nearly every day a follow-up story kept the alleged plot before the public eye. though comparatively little was written when the actual strike leaders were later exonerated. As to the demonstration itself and the police attack on the Unionists, the Tribune-Herald, as well as its parent publication in Honolulu, the Star Bulletin, along with the Advertiser, were characteristically single-minded in their common application of the word riot to describe the massacre, suggesting almost that the Unionists were themselves firing guns. The headline in Hilo's Extra that afternoon read, 36 injured during riot. Union group turned back after firing, and in the Star Bulletin, 36 wounded in Hilo riot. Injuries of 5 men are critical. That a group of unarmed men and women sitting down on the dock was called a riot apparently caused some consternation locally, for on Friday the editorial of the Tribune-Herald tried to defend its use of that term based on definitions in the territorial laws. Specifically Section 6172. Section 6172 reads, menacing demonstrations, menacing language, or gestures, or show of weapons or other signs or demonstrations tending to excite terror in others, are sufficient violence to characterize an unlawful assembly or riot. To the editors of the Tribune-Herald, picket signs and the boos and jeers, in and of themselves were enough to excite terror under this law. So justified, the papers continued to refer to the massacre exclusively in terms of it having been a riot. Each paper published the sheriff's defense without so much as a summary of the Union perspective until Hodgson's report was made public, and that report, it was emphasized, drew no conclusions as to the guilt or wrongdoing of any of the parties. The Hodgson Report. Joseph V. Hodgson, 1899 to 1973, was appointed Attorney General of the Territory by Governor Poindexter just a few weeks before the Hilo Massacre. A native of Boyne, Michigan, he would later join the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General's Department and, after the war, serve on the UN War Crimes Commission in London. As noted earlier, his report on the Hilo Massacre has been taken over the years to be the most reasonable and objective account of the incident possible. It was not released until after a Hilo grand jury had already decided to refuse to bring any indictments against the police. And when the report was submitted to Territorial Governor Poindexter and the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C., it had the desired effect of mollifying the earlier public outrage that had been incited. A careful analysis of Hodgson's report, however, reveals an insidious bias that is only subtly apparent. While he was not so obvious as to condemn the Unionists, as certainly the press and the Chamber of Commerce had, Hodgson overlooked the most glaring examples of deception from police and inter-island witnesses. Worse, he apparently suppressed or ignored evidence that might have shown that the demonstration was legally constituted or that the police involvement was improperly authorized. And, finally, he appears to have totally fabricated some details with respect to the official public notices published in the local paper. The net effect of each of these alterations and amendments is to leave the reader of his report with the impression that the police, with the possible exception of Lieutenant Warren, were guiltless as were the other officials involved. But, on examination of the actual statements and photographs Hodgson accumulated, a less wholesome portrait of the authorities emerges. 3 levels of questions arise as to the legitimacy of the police actions against the Unionists that day that Hodgson did not bother to consider. To begin with, acting harbor master Hasselgren may not have been acting properly within his powers to close the harbor in the first place. Though Kane's neutrality notice came only after police forces had already been committed, it certainly suggests that, prior to Kane's notice, Hasselgren was anything but neutral. He had not himself sought advice from the Territorial Board, while he regularly accepted direction from Scruton and the Chamber of Commerce. Secondly, even without that letter from the Board, there is real question as to the authority of a county police sheriff to enforce closure of the territory's harbor in lieu of a territorial high sheriff, as the Unionists had been told. And, finally, all the other questions aside, the harbor may not in fact have been legally closed. No notice officially closing the harbor was actually published, nor was any attempt made to prevent a considerable crowd of bystanders and onlookers from walking freely throughout the wharf all through that day. If the demonstrators were, in fact, well within their rights to conduct a peaceful demonstration that day, then any police action to prohibit their access with the use of deadly force should have itself been deemed illegal. That Hodgson failed to pursue this line of investigation, and that he seems rather to have either ignored or overlooked such findings when he clearly encountered them in the testimony, casts serious doubts on the objectivity and accuracy of his conclusions. The net effect of such investigatory lapses as noted above is that Hodgson's report, which has always purported to be generous to the Union demonstrators, may actually have been primarily used to placate the parties, at the expense of the justice they desired. grand jury, even while Hodgson was preparing his investigation for Governor Poindexter. The Hilo grand jury was called to consider possible criminal indictments against the police or anyone else who might be responsible for criminal assault. Though Hodgson offered to make his evidence and testimony available to the grand jury, he withheld his conclusions and analysis until after the grand jury returned their verdict. Hodgson's expressed desire not to influence the grand jury is curious. His investigation was by all accounts the most thorough and had the least biased access to most of the available resources. The grand jury, on the other hand, relied almost exclusively on the police's own investigation. As the presiding judge Delbert Metzger remarked on hearing their findings for no indictments, "This report reads more to me like the report of a policy committee of some civic organization than the report of the grand jury. We find a state of emergency existed that does not seem to mean anything as a matter of legal significance. That evidence is not sufficient to warrant an indictment against any person or group of persons. It is a matter of public knowledge. The fact that men were grievously injured by shooting, by bayonet stabbing, by broken jawbones or something of the sort. It seems rather strange to me that there was not any law violated by either one side or the other in an affray of that kind." As the judge was no doubt aware, his comment was closer to the mark than anyone not familiar with the makeup of that grand jury might be able to guess. It seems that the Big Five, especially C. Brewer, and the Hilo Chamber of Commerce, the same civic organization that had ordered the sheriff to commit his forces in the first place, were unusually well represented on that jury. 1. Dodge S. Baker, radio salesman. 2. Ezekiel Baptiste, clerk for Moses Company, whose owner is a member of Chamber. 3. Percy Bailey, Sperry Flour Company sales representative owned by member of Chamber. 4. William Brown, clerk for Davies and Company. 5. David Butchart, cashier Hanamu Sugar Plantation. 6. John L. Dykes, Assistant Secretary First Trust Company of Hilo. 7. O. E. English, Hawaii National Park. 8. Ed. B. Haller, cashier Waiakea Mill Sugar Plantation. 9. E. R. Hartley, bookkeeper Waiakea Mill Sugar Plantation. 10. Xavier L. Helbush, foreman, postman, Glenwood Post Office, Mountain View. 11. E. N. Holmes, J.R., Trias, Holmes Department Dry Goods Store, member of Chamber. 12. Frank Huff, Agency Real Estate Broker, member of Chamber of Commerce. 13. Louis Capla, Economic Trading Company, member of Chamber of Commerce. 14. Antone Kimmy, Manager Progressive Club, Liquor Establishment. 15. Ralph Lau, Manager Hilo Dry Goods, member of Chamber of Commerce. 16. Tomoichi Machida, Machida Drug Store, member of Chamber of Commerce. 17. Costa P. Ramanis, Assistant Manager Hilo Hotel, caters to big business. 18. Michael de F. Spinola, Notary Public, Hilo Chamber of Commerce. 19. Yashio Tanimoto, Tanimoto Variety Store, member Chamber of Commerce. 20. Stanley Williams, Assistant Manager C. Brewer, one of the Big Five, and employer of the longshoremen. James Mattoon of the Clerk's Unit, when called as a witness before this jury, challenged their objectivity to their faces and named each man's affiliation. Far from impugning their motives, however, Mattoon's candor about this blue ribbon jury only incited jurist Ed Haller to seek Mattoon's impeachment. The county's attorney, Beers, who was himself conducting the proceedings, just ignored the remarks, confident of the ultimate outcome that would vindicate the police as well as his own legal advice, on which the police actions were based. Not only Judge Metzger was scandalized by the jury's total vindication of the authorities. In Washington, Director Ernest Gruning summarized his findings to the Secretary of the Interior. After his review of the record, he decried the verdict as a whitewash. Kaiuratani's suit. Unfortunately, Judge Metzger's candid remarks as published in the newspapers were later to further inhibit the plight of the wounded Unionists for a just settlement. Months later, on October 14, 1938, the longshoremen attempted to seek the court's justice, this time by filing a civil suit against Lieutenant Warren, Sheriff Martin, and the other officers. On behalf of Kaiuratani, the first to have fallen that day, Judge Metzger would have normally presided in that case. The sheriff's attorney fought the suit by moving to disqualify Judge Metzger on the basis of his publicized remarks about the grand jury verdict, and by moving against the Union's San Francisco attorney, George Anderson, who filed the suit for them. Hawaii's Supreme Court rules required a mainland attorney to associate with a local firm in order to practice law. Their friend Martin Pence was unable to take the case since he had just been elected county attorney. Unable to find another local lawyer willing to take the case, the suit almost had to be dropped without trial. After a considerable amount of hopeless casting about, the Union finally obtained the services of Honolulu attorney OP source. Seeking $25,149.50 in general and punitive damages. The union was hoping to make this a test case and follow it up with similar actions on behalf of Burt Nakano and the others most severely wounded. But Judge Metzger was disqualified and Judge J. Frank McLaughlin heard the case instead. A 31-year-old Harvard-educated man, born and raised in Massachusetts, Judge McLaughlin was at the time a new resident of the territory in his first judicial appointment looking to a promising judicial career. On November 16th of 1939, over a year after the suit had been filed, the case was heard in Hilo's court of the Fourth Circuit. Little evidence remains of the deliberations or of the makeup of the jury that tried this suit. The record does show that Judge McLaughlin transmitted very specific instructions to the jury, Cs. 6170 and 6184 of the Revised Laws of Hawaii, 1935, which liberally defined unlawful assembly and legally released law officers from liability for any action taken in dealing with unlawful assemblies. There were no instructions relative to the authority of county police on the territorial wharf, nor any instructions relative to the constitutional rights of freedom of assembly. The suit was lost, and, as if that weren't enough, Kai was charged $355.80 for Martin and Warren's defense costs, paying for the legal expenses as best they could with their limited resources. The Hilo Unionists were unable to afford an appeal, and, though there was no justice for them in the courts, public sentiment had begun to swing toward them throughout Hilo. Organizing on that island continued to prosper, and even though Sheriff Martin was re-elected in the following year, it was the Union that had been adjudged innocent in the eyes of more and more of the community. Conclusions and opinions on the massacre. Since none of the Unionists actually died as a result of injuries, there are those who would question the use of the word massacre to describe the bloody police attack that August 1st. In the dictionary we find two definitions of the term. The first is the indiscriminate, merciless killing of a number of human beings, and the second, to defeat overwhelmingly. The term also conjures up the ruthless attacks committed against the unarmed communities of American Indians in the name of manifest destiny. In nearly every sense of the term, it is the appropriate description of Hilo's Bloody Monday. The police detachment was undeniably overwhelming. There was nearly one policeman to every 3 demonstrators, and the police were armed with an arsenal more than adequate to deal with a much larger and more menacing assembly. That the sheriff elected to fall upon an admittedly peaceful demonstration that had made no effort to prevent the unloading of cargo, and unleash repeated volleys of shotgun fire at close range upon unarmed men, women and children alike most certainly qualifies the action as a massacre. Anna Camahel, who took 2 separate hits of buckshot, had, like most of the wounded, to make her own way to a hospital. No ambulances were available, so the wounded, when the police finally pulled back, had to be taken in private cars or buses to Hilo Memorial or one of the various Japanese clinics downtown. Anna, for instance, was taken to 2 different Japanese hospitals before she was finally treated at Dr. Kasimoto's hospital on Piopio Street. To this day she carries one of the pellets which lodged 1/8 of an inch from her lung, where it was too dangerous to remove. Burt Nakano, similarly, was hit by several rounds of buckshot. One of the pellets, which was ricocheted off the ground, flattened like a disc and sliced through his groin, leaving a wound that was for some time thought to be a bayonet wound. He recalls the shooting. "Well, I know I went down. Then I thought I'd get up and move away. I could hear the bullets whizzing over my head. See, I tried to go up. Then I found out. I noticed my left hand was paralyzed. Then my left leg was all paralyzed. Then I knew that I was going to pass out, and I just passed out. I don't know what happened after that until I opened my eyes at the hospital. They piled his body into the 5, as they called the 5-cent bus to Hilo. He would be in the hospital for 17 months while the doctors worked to save his leg. Brother Longshoreman donated blood, and it was touch and go for him for many months. When he was finally out of the hospital, it would be another 19 months of recuperation before he could return to work. 3 years after the massacre, Hodgson was particularly concerned to establish the direction in which the gun squad officers fired their shot. Did they fire into the ground in front of the crowd, as directed by the sheriff and as practiced at the National Guard firing range earlier that week? Or did some of them fire point blank directly into the crowd? He hoped to show that the police had tried to be humane by shooting down at the ground in front of the demonstrators or over their heads instead of dead on. He cited Paul Tollett as one of the Unionists who testified that the police aim was deflected, but the actual transcript of his examination of Tollett reveals some not-so-subtle direction. Question: how did he, Warren, shoot? Down toward the ground, above your heads, or how? Answer: right straight out, sir. Question: straight for the crowd? Answer: the crowd was seated, sir. It would go over their heads. Question: the first shot was over their heads? Answer: yes. He was standing up, sir. It would go over their heads. Question: the only time you actually saw Warren shooting, he shoot over the heads of the group? Answer: that is the first time. Question: and nobody got hurt as a result of that discharge, so far as you know? Answer: so far as I know, because my eyes were always forward. In disregarding Tollett's first response, right straight out, and using the quote, over their heads, Hodgson has created the impression in his report that Warren was shooting his riot gun into the air over their heads instead of the straight from the hip shooting that Tollett was really trying to describe. Similar problems arise over the testimony about the other shots that Hodgson maintains were primarily shot at the ground in front of the demonstrators instead of head-on. Doctors, for instance, removed a considerable number of buckshot pellets that were whole and had obviously not been ricocheted off the ground. Furthermore, in view of the way Burt Nakano was most severely wounded by one of the shots that had been flattened after impact with the ground before it sliced through the arteries in his leg, Hodgson's premise that ricocheting the shot was more humane may not have been valid. The problem with all these fine distinctions about the direction of the shot or the number of birdshot versus buckshot rounds fired is that they divert our attention from the basic issue. The violence of August 1, 1938 was, after all, inexcusable and unnecessary. It should, indeed, be remembered as the massacre. It has been called so that we are not tempted to reduce its significance or forget the lesson it should teach us about the civil right of all Americans to demonstrate peacefully. When we attempt to arrest conflict by silencing dissent, the first and most regrettable casualties are our national principles. It is rightly said that we are doomed to repeat history that we are foolish enough to forget. Let us, then, be sure to remember Hilo's Bloody Monday not just out of respect for the courage of Hawaii's early Union brothers and sisters and the many injuries they endured to build their unions, but with the resolve necessary to protect another generation from the need to suffer this struggle ever again. The Hilo Massacre, Hawaii's Bloody Monday, August 1, 1938, by William J. Puette, Ph.D., as read by Shits Leopold.